Chapter 16. Springing the Trap. Repeat what you told me. Marcus put a hand on his prisoner's neck. There's no need for that, the wretched man said. I came looking for you. But for good or ill, I wonder. General Silius looked to his commander. Can we trust a deserter, sir? We trusted the last one, Germanicus said. He gestured to the prisoner. Speak. The deserter cowered away from my master and began to speak quickly. Please, masters, I do not deceive you. Arminius waits you to the north. He has chosen to make a stand at the old Angrevar barrier. I risk much in telling you this. Please, have mercy. The wretch's eyes started from his head. The man's skin was flushed, and the corners of his mouth glistened with spittle. He rubbed at the mark Marcus had left on his throat. General Silius shrugged. At least the bastard's staying to fight. The informant started to nod enthusiastically, then winced and rubbed his neck again. If you wouldn't mind not interrupting, old friend, Germanicus said. Silius gave him a guilty look and waited silently for his superior to continue. So Arminius is awaiting me at the barrier? Germanicus asked. The tribesman nodded. And he really plans to stand after the losses we inflicted? The tribesman gave another tentative nod. Germanicus's eyes narrowed. You know what will happen if your tale proves false, or you've forgotten to tell me everything you know? Marcus's hand tightened on the deserter's shoulder. I'm going to tell him, the man whined. Tell me what? Germanicus leaned closer. I doubt I need to spell out how differently this interrogation could be conducted. The deserter looked back at Marcus's stony features and sweat broke out on his brow. It's a trap, of course. He told me to come and fetch you there. He plans to catch you just as he did Varus. But surely he's lost so many men already, he can't hope to achieve such a feat, General Tubero piped up. The deserter laughed weakly. That is the very arrogance he's relying upon. Since the rout at Adistaviso, new men have been trickling in. He even has cavalry units ready. He plans to trap you between his riders and the barrier. These Germans must breed like flies to be ready for such an ambush so soon, Tubero scoffed. It is true, I swear it, the deserter said. My lord, Silius said, I'd be the first to echo Virgil and say I fear Greeks, even bearing gifts, but my man here has questioned the brute thoroughly and I believe he speaks the truth. Germanicus rubbed his smooth chin as he pondered the situation. After a moment of silence he locked eyes with the deserter again, causing the unfortunate man to shrink in on himself even further, then nodded. I agree with you, General. I also think we should spring this trap Arminius has set for us. Letting him think that he is luring us in seems the best way to get him to stand so we can deliver the decisive blow. There was a general murmur of assent to the last observation. So all that remains is to hammer out the specifics, Silius said. He looked around the tent. It might perhaps be best to split our troops, leave the cavalry to deal with the force he plans to bring up behind us, and the rest to fight him at the barrier. Germanicus grinned. That would rather ruin his surprise. It seems a sound suggestion to me. Might I request the leadership of the cavalry, my lord? Tubero asked. I have yet to be given a chance to distinguish myself. Marcus's eyebrow twitched at this blatant self-promotion, but if any of Caesar's command staff noticed his reaction, they gave no sign. The chief was looking thoughtful again. Something we must discuss, General, but... He looked at the man on the floor. I think it would be best to explore our options without the prisoner present. Germanicus waved a hand and Marcus dragged the deserter to his feet. He saluted Silius, then left the tent. I slipped out after him, leaving our betters to decide how best to spend our lives. As it transpired, we were not to be part of the cavalry force that would meet Arminius's ambush in the forest. Silius decided he wanted to keep Marcus close. As he put it, all Tubero's boys have to do is wait for the enemy to come to them. A good scout's more use for spotting dangers in advance. So it was decided that my master and I would be going in with the legions in their assault on the barrier. No sooner had we come close to the proposed site of the battle than we encountered small skirmish units. The general was contemptuous of this obvious attempt to draw us on and made sure to keep his men in check while dealing with these minor assaults. If this is an indication of their new strategy, I don't think we'll have much to worry about, the general commented to Marcus as we watched the whooping tribesmen disappearing back into the trees for the third time that day. My master shared his general's good humour. I can't imagine why they think we'll take the bait, he said. Then his smile faltered slightly. Let's just hope that Tubero keeps their fellows off our back. Indeed. Our march finally slowed and we broke through the tree line. The men had already begun to assemble on the field in front of the German earthworks. The earthworks themselves represented a formidable obstacle, a massive barrier long ago raised during some dispute between local tribes. The land before it was narrow, hemmed in by rough terrain. Behind, the river and marshes made indirect approach difficult. A good bottleneck against advancing troops, and the perfect anvil to smash our forces against. The Germans called out curses and threw rocks from the top of their wall, but we took our time, knowing that Germanicus and the other legions, including both units of the Praetorian Guard, were moving through the trees to the German flanks. When we judged the time was right, Silius dropped his sword, giving the signal for our advance. For once, Marcus and I were not in the front of the charge, and we could watch as the massed troops marched forward. "We'll have a task reaching them without siege equipment," Marcus commented as he edged his horse forward next to the general. "That's one of the perks of command," Silius mused. "We aren't the poor sons of bitches who have to worry about being first over that wall." "True enough, but I feel pretty useless where I am." My master's voice was tense. "So eager to get yourself killed, Marcus?" the general asked. "Segmund told me you had a good reason to want to get back in one piece. Else I'd never have put you next to me." Marcus raised an eyebrow at the use of his first name. "I've good reason to get back, sure enough. I just wonder how we'll reach them without losing many good men." "You're free to start cutting ladders," Silius smiled. "I wouldn't worry, though. We had to travel light, but Caesar still has a few surprises for them." Stones began to rattle off the upraised shields of the men in our front rank. The German cries intensified. They threw down their scorn along with javelins and heavier rocks as we drew close, but the men held steady, deflecting most of the missiles and taking any losses stoically. More than one tribesman stole a glance at the trees behind us, no doubt hoping to see the surprise attack they had planned, but there was no relief for them from that direction. Instead, as we reached the foot of the barrier, Germanicus and his division appeared on their flank. A trumpet sounded and the ranks of the new arrivals parted to reveal squads of more lightly armoured men. A low hum built, and then the air was full of whistling lead. Germans yelped and bellowed in consternation as the slingers Caesar had brought with him unleashed their missiles. They ducked behind the earthworks or tried to deflect the lead pellets with their shields. Silius watched the chaos in his enemy's ranks with quiet amusement. "Poor fools don't even realize that there's worse to come," he said to Marcus. "See there?" He pointed. While the slingers did their work, small squads of men were preparing lightweight war machines. "We may not have bought heavy siege equipment, but those scorpions will keep the swine's heads down," Silius said. Marcus gave a low whistle. "I didn't realize we'd brought so many," he said. Silius smiled. "Last-minute addition. We haven't bothered to use them much before because the Germans never stay still long enough. But this seemed like a good time to put the engineers to work." "How many are there?" Marcus asked as the artillery crew scurried from one scorpion to another, checking the tension on the ropes and sliding bolts into position. "Over 400, I think it is." The general bared his teeth. "I wouldn't want to be a rebel today." Hundreds of the light artillery pieces were set up in the space of minutes. If the sling bullets had made the air hum, then the snap of the sinews against wood and the howl of the bolts as they flew made it positively scream. A cheer went up from the massed legionnaires as one bolt pierced 3 men. The impact was enough to jerk the men back on their feet. Their limp bodies teetered backwards for an instant, then the press of those gathered behind them sent the skewered corpses rolling down the earth barrier. The artillery took its toll, and the defenders had no choice but to fall back to cover. The legions could climb. More horns blared, and the 2nd Division began to advance. Germanicus Caesar himself led them, followed by the Praetorian legions. Men cried out in adulation as their leader passed, for he had chosen to go into battle with his head bared. "He insisted on leading the charge," Silius muttered. "Didn't want the men to think that he expected them to go anywhere he wouldn't. There's something to that, I suppose," the general added grudgingly as he drew his sword. "Are you ready to keep him alive, Atratinus?" "It might be easier if he kept his helmet on," Marcus observed. "Perhaps not. The men will fight harder for seeing his face. There's another reason for it, I think," Silius said. "What do you mean, sir?" Marcus sounded wary. "Come, you must suspect it." Marcus looked at his commander blankly. The general winked. "If everyone sees where he is, there's less chance of one of those Praetorians Tiberius sent slipping a sword into him by mistake." Marcus's eyes widened, but before he could make any comment, the general was barking his own orders to advance. Marcus looked to me. "That's why we leave politics to Segmund and his sort." He ruffled my ear. I whined slightly and looked to the tide of men pouring up the earthy slope of the barrier. The battle was beginning in earnest. Trumpets and the clash of swords were all the men around me could hear, but my ears were sharper. I heard the sobbing of the fallen and the wailing of souls wrenched from flesh too full of pain to live in. The stench of the dying would not be far behind those jarring sounds. "It's all right, Ferox," Marcus assured me. Stay close. He dismounted and I followed. My love would allow me to do nothing else. Fear began to build. I focused on Marcus. Things would only get worse if he left me behind. I have no way to properly express the horror that gripped me, and the shame I felt. Once I would have run at my master's side. Now I slunk forward and flinched at every sound. It was as if the scars on my shoulder ran deeper than I knew, a crack through which my fear leaked straight into my pounding heart. The old ferocity was still there, but it was tempered, corrupted with a stiffness that I found hard to shake off, a wariness of the dark. We started to climb. In that initial advance, most of the men who went up came tumbling back down, but a few of them held, and those few were joined by the men behind them. Officers like Marcus were quick to run in behind the slaughter, bearing up the men's will and urging them onwards. The grass which had grown up on the sides of the barrier had been flattened down by the army's advance. The pulped vegetation made each step treacherous, and by the time you reached the top, the churned ground was slick with the blood of the fallen. It was an act of will as much as any physical feat to reach the top of the incline. "Come on, boys!" Marcus was bent double to compensate for the slope ahead. He sometimes used the edge of his shield to help steady himself against the packed earth. The men about us roared in response, and some of the ice about my heart melted. I would not have to face the darkness alone. We came on in a wall of steel, daring the German spears, and if the men around me felt the apprehension that gripped me, it passed just as quickly when the blood began to flow. Marcus threw himself at the enemy line, and we were forced to follow, all fear forgotten. No man drew the legions on so well as Caesar himself. I caught only glimpses, for the fighting was at its thickest around him. The tribesmen knew that to end him would be to strike a devastating blow, but the cost of all their attempts to reach him proved too high. Roman hearts are stubborn. The men loved him, and just as I forced down my fear and followed Marcus into the very breach of Hades, so the soldiers gathered about him, offering all they had to bring their commander safe across that lip of earth. Marcus and I had climbed the barrier in the wake of the first wave of the assault, so we were over in a matter of minutes. The ground beyond the slope was flat and already littered with bodies. It would take hours to shift the Germans massed upon it. The first man Marcus killed was almost half again as tall as he was, an Angravari warrior wielding a roughly forged iron broadsword. Marcus ducked under the sweep of the oversized weapon and opened the tribesman's gut with a single stroke. He let out a startled cry and lurched backwards as a second man tried to skewer him with a broad-tipped spear. He only just managed to turn the spear thrust with his shield, and in doing so he was forced back, allowing his attacker to take full advantage of his longer weapon. I lunged at the spearman's leg, and while he was diverted, Marcus's blade swept out, almost decapitating the unfortunate tribesman. As the fighting went on and our energy flagged, the kills became less dramatic. We settled into the rhythm of the legions. Centurions' whistles cut the air, and units assumed proper formation. As each man faltered, a new fighter would step up to replace him, giving the winded man a short respite. It was slow, mechanical, and utterly irresistible. The killers of Rome were workmen, and the passion of their German counterparts was soon spent against the inexorable tide of the legions. At last we began to push them back. By then Marcus and I were bleeding from a dozen tiny wounds, and the tribesmen found themselves forced into the woods with a marsh behind them. This was our chance to deal them a telling blow, and the cry soon went up, "Take no prisoners!" The orders echoed up and down our line. With nowhere to run, the Germans were forced to stand, and the toll was grim. I could not tell how many fell beyond that wall. We waded through the dead. The eyes of our victims betrayed their despair. A few didn't even flinch as my teeth found them. The men knew death was inevitable. All they asked for was a quick release. Even through the battle haze there was a dim resonance when I looked into those men's faces. It is a terrible thing to see your own weariness in another's eyes, to know that beyond the flapping of wings and the howling that accompany every battle, there is only a long and endless silence. No sound can fill it. No matter how you call, no echo will return to you. It is a truth from which we all flinch. At the last it is the stillness rather than the storm that claims you. Sometimes it's only refusing to acknowledge it that keeps you alive. Had I been able to see that truth when I fought Ajax, I surely would have died. Every warrior knows that the end of struggle is inevitable, but what is a warrior without his struggle? We offered and received death until it was dark enough that the tribesmen who had survived the day could slip away. Then it was over. We had won our piece of earth, but can such loss for so small a thing be called a victory? We retreated to the camp that had been built not far from the wall. As night settled, we were joined by Tubero and his force. Caesar was not pleased to learn that the cavalry had not shared our success, and that Arminius had once more slipped from his grasp.